Good evening. Please sit. And I am brand new to this audio technology, and I wonder if this is the right volume. Is everything working? Martha's nodding. Looking good, feeling fine. It is such a privilege to be sharing words with you tonight about one of my favorite biblical personae, Mary, the Mother of God. She and I go a long way back. As a baby, like all of my two siblings and like all of my many, many cousins in Canada and in Ireland, I teethed, so developed my little chopper teeth on a gold medallion of the Virgin Mary that hung around my mother's neck. And this is a practice that goes back many generations in my family. There's a collection of gold Mary medallions going back and back and back with tooth marks on the back of the circle showing where many, many decades worth of babies, I won't say centuries because that would be an exaggeration, but many, many, many decades of babies have learned how to chew using Mary as their pacifier. The relationship is even deeper than that, deep as that is. Some of you know a bit about my story. I was raised Roman Catholic, and like Anglicans, Catholics have a very particular relationship with the Virgin Mary. In my house where I grew up, devotion was particularly strong to Our Lady of Lourdes. My grandmother paid a pilgrimage to Lourdes that was very important to her, and she often spoke of the pilgrimage and had I will use the accurate word, she had a kitschy, plastic, blue and white and gold Virgin Mary bottle filled with the magical water of Lourdes on her bookshelf. I found it weird and mysterious as a kid, but as I grew up, I came to understand what my grandmother saw in the water from Lourdes. And as an adult, I wish my grandmother was still alive so I could share with her some of my realizations about what she was all about all those years. But for my grandmother and for many people in my family, going back generations, who made the pilgrimage to the waters of Lourdes in the south of France, the kind of tacky, touristy stuff that's grown up around the city of Lourdes in France is totally beside the point. What Our Lady is about, what Mary is about, is healing, is reaching deep into our trauma, be it physical, be it spiritual, be it mental, and helping us to heal, pouring out the waters of healing. And she of course is about so much more. The passage that we heard tonight is of course the Magnificat, which in context, to put the context in one way, Mary, a brown Jewish teenage girl from Palestine with an irregular pregnancy, pays a comfortable visit to her cousin Elizabeth, who is also pregnant. And they talk about God and the meaning of God. And because their visit was a relaxed visit and a joyful visit, I thought that I would do something slightly experimental in my talk in order to bring us into the holy space of the Magnificat, which is such a beautiful prayer about justice and about healing. So what I'm going to suggest, in the tradition of mindfulness meditation or Zen meditation, for those of you who have sampled those forms of prayer and contemplation, I'm going to propose an entire minute of silence. You might say this is in Quaker mode, for those of you who have experienced Quaker spirituality. So in the minute of silence, if it is your way to pray silently with words, by all means do so. If it is part of your way or something you'd like to try, simply to follow your own breath and realize that in your breath and in your body, like Mary, you are part of the body of Christ, perfect and eternal. For that is what we are at our deepest part, I have learned from Mary. Meditate on that for a minute. I'm just going to think about my breath. I will be in charge of counting the 60 seconds. I'm not going to use my meditation timer with the simulated bell sound. I will be the timer. So I just invite you to a minute, 60 seconds. Ding. That's me simulating a bell. Welcome back. He has pulled the mighty from their thrones. He has exalted the lowly. Given that Mary partnered with God, Sophia, in bringing Jesus, perhaps the greatest feminist in the world, I think it's appropriate that we hear the words again. She pulled the mighty from their thrones. She lifts up the lowly. The prayer of the Magnificat has mattered a great deal to people in justice struggles all throughout the world in modern times and in pre-modern times as well. Explicitly, Mary is reflecting on herself. She is poor. She is Mary of Nazareth, a peasant woman, probably illiterate, not having any kind of economic or political power in her context, certainly not having wealth, certainly not having education or status. And suddenly, pursuant to an announcement by an angelic visitor, she is the mother of God, the mother of the coming Messiah. She knows, thus, that it is the way of God to pull the mighty from their thrones, the Caesars, the Herods, the local bullies in Nazareth. It is God's way, conversely, to lift up the lowly, the people like Mary, the people like her neighbors and her friends and those that she loves. I know that the theme of this speaker series is symbols of God, and Mary has been one of the great symbols of God for 2,000 years, symbolizing God the Mother. And she's acquired all kinds of exalted titles. Theotokos, the bearer of God, the Queen of Heaven, she's even sometimes called. The one that I am most partial to is one that Pope Francis is currently promoting. Pope Francis encourages Christians to consider Mary specifically as Our Lady, the undoer of knots. It's one that I love very much for a whole bunch of reasons. I love it in part because it's domestic. We know that Mary's work was domestic, was very much of the home. She would be literally undoing knots all of the time. Clearly, what Pope Francis is getting at with Our Lady, the undoer of knots, is the concept that Mary and her loving, compassionate, revolutionary call for justice may be just the friend we need in the undoing of the knots that plague us, be it knots as a church, knots as a society, or probably most pressingly, knots in our own lives, whatever it is that is afflicting us, whatever it is that is keeping us down, whatever it is that is keeping us from seeing that we are part of the body of Christ, that we are members, that we are absolutely dignified, that for those of us who have some claim to being lowly, which is probably most of humanity when you count all the suffering that there is in our world and in our lives, that we all, to some degree or other, great or small, are the lowly and are exalted by God. Our Lady, the Undoer of Knots means a great deal for me as a queer person with a complex gender identity and a husband. The problem of LGBTQ rights is a knot, at least in Christianity. And a great blessing in my life in recent years has been a growing, humbling feeling that God, and I experience God through Mary in many ways, largely because of how I was raised and how I'm coming to know God, that God is undoing this central knot, is healing this central pain and trauma in my own life and in the lives of so many that I love. A theologian that I have a great esteem for, James Allison, says that the love of Our Lady Mary for LGBTQ people is perhaps the worst kept secret in the church. I love that very, very much. When we reflect on Mary's words of the mighty being pulled from their thrones and the lowly being exalted, those of us who are queer or have loved ones who are queer cannot help but see and know that Mary is indeed referring in part to us. A stumbling block, I think, for getting to know Mary is the way that she has been desexualized, even dehumanized, lifted up as the Queen of Heaven and the Queen of the angels. Mary, as symbol of God in the church, often seems totally beyond humanity. Elizabeth Johnson, a nun who's also a professor of theology at Fordham, has proposed that over the centuries, qualities that rightly belong to God, God the Mother, God the source of compassion, God the one whose generosity is limitless, God the one who helps us no matter what and picks us up and kisses our wounds the way a mother does. These fundamental attributes of God have been attached to the symbol of Mary, the character of Mary, over centuries and centuries. She proposes that what is required at this point is a migration of those qualities, a migration of the qualities of maternal love, maternal compassion, back to God. And in so doing, suddenly a great other gift emerges, a clearer picture of Mary of Nazareth, the actual historical woman who parented Jesus. And one of the great gifts that comes into focus when we start thinking about Mary of Nazareth, the mischievous and courageous brown Jewish girl with an irregular pregnancy who says to her equally pregnant cousin Elizabeth, the mighty are to be pulled from their thrones and the lowly are to be exalted. One of the great gifts of getting to know her is indeed that suddenly we are reminded in a shocking, powerful way, she is human. Her son is human. She as a human being, by virtue of being a true human being, is a symbol of God. The way that we all are, by virtue of being human, women or men or other, members of the body of Christ. Rosemary Rufford Rather is a theologian who says that the reason God chose to incarnate specifically as a biological male was to make a point about gender. Jesus did not lead the life of a manly, enthroned man. Jesus came to earth and led a life that Rosemary Rufford Rather, the theologian, describes as the kenosis of patriarchy, the emptying out of male authority and male domination of women. This is how Jesus lived. He had women among his apostles. He gave up male authority, male power, male security in order to talk about love and compassion and vulnerability. Indeed, his death is the ultimate act of vulnerability and, dare I say it, penetration. Christ opens up for us the reality of the genderlessness of God. And perhaps it is time for us to contemplate, where did Christ get all of these ideas? Of course he was divinely inspired, and of necessity, a fundamental channel for part of that divine inspiration, for his radical understanding of gender, his radical understanding of justice, his work throughout his lifetime in pulling the mighty from their thrones and in exalting the lowly, of necessity, had to have come from his mother. I'll conclude by reflecting, I think, finally, on the title of the Magnificat itself. When I was a teenager and starting to study the Bible, I thought that when Mary says, "My soul magnifies the Lord," it was a magnifying glass image, like somehow her soul is making God bigger. And it's interesting how the word magnify has evolved. Perhaps that is still, perhaps the way we use magnify now, in the sense of enlarging, owes something to the King James use of the word magnify as the opening word of the Magnificat. But in fact, a translation that is closer to the original Greek word is glorify. It is clearer and arguably much truer to the original sense of Mary's great prayer in the book of Luke, to say not, to attribute to Mary, not the words, "My soul magnifies God," but "My soul glorifies God." And this is an image that I think is to be relished for each of us in our own way, clearly, by virtue of being ourselves, by virtue of pursuing justice through our daily acts of kindness, and perhaps through some voting that some of us will be engaged in this month, are pursuing justice and have opportunities constantly to pull the mighty from their thrones and exalt the lowly. This is not violence. In other words, we're not pulling the mighty from their thrones and killing them. We are pulling them from their thrones and making them humble and giving them the opportunity to be human. What greater glorification could there be? Thank you.
Amen.